Hello, I hope you're doing well today. My name is Ian Green, and I'm the musician for Music Dreams and also Ian J. Green, two different artist profiles you can find wherever you stream your music. And also, I love to teach music lessons, and I've been teaching for a long time, teaching many years. I've got a lot of experience as a music festival adjudicator, as a full-time piano teacher, theory teacher. I also love teaching history and harmony and also enjoy offering tutorials like this one online to help students as they could work on different topics. Now, today we're going to be looking at a little bit of a tricky topic related to intervals, and this can be found as a supplement to the Intermediate Elementary Music Rudiments course by Mark Sarnecki. This is a really helpful book that students have found really helpful over the years, and I'm so glad that Mr. Sarnecki is continuing to publish it and offer it available for and make it available for students in the intermediate levels. Now, today what we're going to be doing is discussing and looking at different types of intervals that might be tricky to find if the bottom note does not contain a major scale. So let's go over to a checklist that we have, which can be found on page 49 in the textbook. We'll look through the material together, and then we'll also discuss this topic a little bit more closely. Now, as you will remember from other tutorials we've looked on and talked about, we've talked first of all about what an interval is, the space between two notes, and also how to find an interval or how to create an interval by counting from the bottom note to the top note to see the space between those two notes. Now, traditionally, we would look at the bottom note to see what scale we would want to use in order to find the quality of that type of interval. So if we start on C, where you can see the arrow is, or the cursor is, we would think of the C major scale as the scale to use to match to the top note, to see if the top note is in fact a major, perfect, augmented, or diminished, or minor interval. There are different types of intervals, of course, that depend on the number of semitones or half steps that are away from the top note. So if we start on C and we go over to our piano here, we can see that by reviewing this, we can see that from C to E is a third. But from that bottom note, we can also think of the major scale of C major and know that E is part of the C major scale because the C major key signature contains 0 sharps and flats. And therefore, with this set of notes with no accidentals written, no sharps or flats written, then this note, E, is part of the C major scale. Now, if we wanted to change that note to go from C to E flat, we would be lowering that third down a half step and making that third into a minor third. Now we can also alter notes and alter intervals by changing the bottom note as well. By doing that, we would change the bottom note and make the interval smaller by a semitone. But something that's interesting is that sometimes we might have notes where there's a scale that does not exist. So let's say we want to think of the scale of G sharp, for example. And we want to use G sharp to D sharp. So we'll write those notes. Just as an example, I'm just putting this in here so you can see it. This is kind of an addendum to this, but just for the visual learners out there. G sharp to D sharp. So if we think of all the scales that we have in the circle of fifths, G sharp major does not technically exist. So might be wondering then, well, how do I find the space between the notes if there's the scale for the bottom note does not exist in musical notation? So what you do for this type of interval is you take the bottom note and move it down, keeping the same note name, to a note that does have a scale. So in this case, if we take G sharp and we move it down to G, we know G major exists in the circle of fifths. And so therefore, if we move the bottom note, we also have to move the top note down the same distance. So we can then rewrite in our imagination the note G to D. Now by doing that, we can count then up the notes. And this is a fifth, and it's essentially a perfect fifth from G to D, because G is part and D are part of the G major scale. So if we know that we already moved the original interval from G sharp to D sharp by moving both notes down a half step, we know then that through logic, the spacing between G sharp to D sharp is the same as G to D. So therefore, the interval of a perfect fifth also works with the original notes, G sharp and D sharp, that we wrote down. So that's a helpful little tip when looking at an interval where the bottom note does not have a corresponding major scale. It's important to keep the same note name, but to change the interval by altering the bottom note to match a note that contains a major scale, and changing the top note as well. Then you can find the space between the normal notes and also the space between the notes that are given in the example. So what we can do as well is look at a couple of different homework questions together. But I think that the most helpful way to do this would be to alter a couple of these. Let's say that we want to look at page 49, but let's look at the second line where we are going to be in using the note F, and we want to write these intervals below a given note. So we're going to work on some of these together. So the first answer, if we count down from F, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would be A. But now if we go over to the piano and match the note A to F, and we think of the A major scale, the major scale for A major is F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, the key signature. So we know that F natural has to be a minor sixth. So in order to make this a major sixth, when we have to write the interval below a given note, we have to change the bottom note. We can't change the top note. That one's given. That one's provided for us. So to make this interval from a minor interval into a major, we change the bottom note to A flat. Let's do this one here. Augmented fourth below F. So we'll count down from F, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we know that a fourth below F is C. Now if we look at this interval here, we know that the C major scale contains 0 sharps and flats, and therefore F is a perfect fourth in this interval combination. Now in order to make this interval larger, we have to go down a half step, keeping the same note name of C, but adding an accidental. So we go from C and F to C flat and F. Now let's do this one here, where we want to go to F, but we want to create an augmented second. Now if we count down from F down 1, 2, we would get E. So we'll draw an E there. Now from E to F, E major has 4 sharps, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp. So this interval that we just wrote is a minor second. So in order to make it an augmented second, we need to go major second and then minor second, augmented second by making it even bigger. But we also have to think about using the note of E as our traditional note, but adding an accidental. So if we go from E down 1/2 step, we would go to E flat. That would be a major second. And then to make it even larger, we would have to go to E double flat. Now, if we were to look at this interval and say, okay, what does this interval spell? And we didn't have the answer there. This would be one of those examples where E double flat major does not technically exist in the circle of fifths. So then this would be one of those answers where we would have to alter the bottom note and the top note to match it to a note that is contained in the circle of fifths, find that spacing, and then use that same spacing when we label that tricky interval. So this handy checklist actually is really helpful for adjusting intervals below a given note. If to make a major interval minor, you raise the bottom note 1/2 step. So if we were to go over to the piano back to C and E, we want to make that interval smaller, but we change the bottom note. We raise the bottom note a 1/2 step. You can see how the spacing is smaller. To make an interval, a major interval diminished, you raise the bottom note 2/2 steps. Thinking still that you're keeping the same note name. So C to C sharp to C double sharp and E. To make a perfect interval diminished, you raise the bottom note 1/2 step, perfect fourth, diminished fourth. And to make a major or perfect interval augmented, you lower the bottom note 1/2 step, major third, augmented third, from C and E to C flat and E. So this handy chart on page 49 is really helpful because it helps to outline some of those tricky intervals that and spacing between intervals that might not make full sense, because when you're looking at the example on paper and then you match it to the piano, you're like, boy, this looks really strange. It's good to use that chart. And also to use the tip that I suggested, where if the bottom note that you write, either that's given or that you have to find, does not contain a major scale in the circle of fifths, then you have to alter, it's suggested to alter the bottom note and the top note down or up, depending on where you are, to use a scale that does exist in the circle of fifths. You find that distance and then match the same distance to the original example, because then it just makes life a lot easier. I do hope this information was helpful. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I look forward to seeing you again for another tutorial soon. And until then, have a wonderful day.